Well, we'll go ahead and get rolling today. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I am Dwayne Brejak. I am the Executive Director for the Michigan chapter of NASW. I am a macro licensed social worker. We're going to be talking about liability today. Michigan's one of those weird states that we actually have a macro license. So I know for some of you who may have been on our past webinars, we've had some specific conversations around licensing directly. But we're very excited to have you all here with us. We have almost 100 participants on our line today. I was not sure how this topic would go down across the country, but we know that liability and risks are just a regular everyday conversation in social work. So much of our practice lives in gray spaces. And so we wanted to take some time now to talk to you all, many of you who are students or new professionals, about what are some of the common liability risks that you may experience in a social work program as you're entering the workforce, and then once you are in the field. We're so excited to have our three panelists from Assurance Services and the NASW RRG here today. We have Betsy Cauble, Dina Larsen, and Lonnie Ropp with us. If you've been on an NASW event, you may have seen one of their faces before. They are some fabulous colleagues from across the country. I will let them tell you a little bit about themselves in just a moment. But if you have questions today, please feel free to use the chat feature, to use the raise your hand feature. We do ask that you stay muted unless you're called on, just because we've got a large group here today. We're going to go until we are out of questions or time. We have until 7:30, so we'll see how that fills up. I hope that many of you on have some questions as you've been in the field or are entering the field about how liability and risk will impact you as a social worker. I know when I was a student, I graduated 10 years ago, but nobody really talked to us about liability. Like my program, I went to the University of Michigan School of Social Work. We had blanket coverage as a student in our social work program. And that was like kind of it. It was a passing mention at the beginning of our MSW programs, but I never really thought about how it realistically could impact me. And ever since I've been at NASW, I have seen the intersection of where students and new professionals can fall into these liability situations. And so we're going to have lots of case scenarios from our three panelists today. They're going to tell you some of the things that they hear, and then we'll get your questions answered. This is part of our National Student Series, so we're doing these every month. Our next event will, starting next month, will be on the third Thursday of the month from 6 to 7:30, and that will be our consistent time for the next year. Our August programming is going to be with Savvy, and that is going to be specifically on student loan repayment, best practices, and all of the different student loan forgiveness programs that are out there. So we know many of us care about that. Until we can get student loans canceled, we have to kind of navigate these complex student debt webs. So I will put in registration information for that by the time we close today. We will have the session recorded, which reminds me, sorry, it was already going. So we will have this available on the national site after today as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, Lonnie, Dina, and Betsy, and let's get rolling for today.
Okay. Would you like us to introduce ourselves?
Yeah, I think that'd be fabulous.
Okay, I'll start. My name is Betsy Cauble. I've been involved with NASW forever, since I was a student. That's too long ago to mention, excuse me. I am a retired social work professor and department head from Kansas State University. I've done a ton of stuff as a social worker in other ways. One of the things I most appreciate about the profession is the opportunity to do a lot of different things. So I've worked in child welfare, I've done family therapy, I've been an administrator, lots and lots of opportunities. So I'm excited for you all because you're just getting started and you're going to get to have all of those opportunities. I have served on the NASW Board of Directors, and I currently serve on both the RRG Board of Directors and the NASW, which is the insurance company that allows us to have the RRG Board of Directors. I serve on both of those, and one of the things that's unique, and you'll hear us talk about this a little bit, is that the insurance product that's been developed through ASI, social workers participate on the board. And that makes a difference in the sense that we're able to talk about what the issues are that social workers have and how liability, professional liability insurance can help mediate some of those. So that's who I am. So Lonnie, you want to go next?
Sure, and thanks for the introduction, Betsy. My name is Lonnie Ropp, and I work with the NASW Risk Retention Group. And that is our company name for the liability insurance program. And I'm the underwriter, and I also oversee distribution. But the interesting thing is that as an underwriter, you make sometimes tough decisions, but the most important job that you do is to make sure that the policy and the support for the policyholders is there on a consistent basis and that everybody can count on what they buy. And so that's what I stand behind, and that's my most favorite part of my job. But definitely when I have, I'm sort of an insurance person, so you'll find me maybe sometimes in this, even in the course of this discussion, if something is a practice specific question, because I'm an insurance nerd, I'm going to defer it off to Betsy instead, because she's the practice expert. And so there's definitely a difference between, insurance and, practice efforts and in navigating that. So it is definitely a big value, and I'm appreciative not only to serve social workers as they emerge from the different institutions, but just long term, because what insurance person wouldn't absolutely be so excited to have you all as their policy holder. So I'm really blessed in that regard. So I do thank you guys, and look forward to our conversation today.
So I guess that just leaves me. I work alongside Lonnie and Betsy. My name is Dina Larsen, and I'm a little bit unique here because I'm not a social worker. I'm a paralegal by profession. I've been a paralegal for about 35 years. And the first half of my career, I spent working in a law firm defending healthcare providers. And then I moved to the job that I have now and worked a little closer with healthcare providers. And for the last 10 years, I have been talking to social workers, answering more questions than I can even imagine. There are very few questions that you could have that I have not already heard or haven't seen a claim come across my desk. I see both risk management issues and claims issues. Hopefully, though, if we handle the risk management stuff correctly in advance, the claim piece doesn't come. And I did see a couple of familiar names as I was flipping through the attendees. So I'm really glad to see everybody here. As you'll hear from us as we go forward, the only stupid question is the one you don't ask. So we'll get started talking. We've got some general topics to cover, but as we go through, if you've got a question, raise your hand, put it in the chat. Dwayne's keeping an eye on that for us. So here we go.
Okay, well, I sort of think we should start with the most basic question. What is professional liability insurance, and why should you have it? Dina, why don't you start about that?
What is professional liability insurance? In a very simplistic way, I like to compare it to your car insurance. You don't drive your car without having insurance. Why would you drive your practice without having insurance? This insurance covers your profession, your giving of social work services. So as Lonnie said to me earlier today, insure before you serve. So you should have professional liability insurance coverage in place before you see that first client. Because if something goes wrong with that first client, they're unhappy with you, they don't like the way you give services, and they get mad enough and they file a licensing board complaint against you, you want an insurance company an insurance policy that can provide an attorney to assist you. Attorneys, having worked for them for a lot of years, I can tell you that a pretty average rate for an attorney is anywhere between $400 to $500 an hour, if not more, depending on which state you're in, which city you're in. And you can see at $500 an hour, and it could take 20 to 30 hours to fully process a licensing board complaint. We're talking a lot of money. And unless you're independently wealthy while you're practicing your social work, you want to have an insurance policy to protect you. You've got an auto insurance policy to protect your car. You got homeowners insurance to protect your house, protect your practice, protect your license, have that coverage. Betsy, what did I miss?
Well, I was going to add that you don't have to be licensed to be sued.
True, very true.
You can be sued for pretty much anything that happens in the course of your activities with a client. Many of you will go into public welfare or child welfare practice as you graduate. That's not an uncommon thing for beginning social workers to do. And you can be held accountable for things that go wrong in the course of events with your clients. And it's not uncommon for one of the members of our board is a social worker and an attorney. And he always says, when there's any lawsuit, they'll sue everybody who is in the course of taking care of a client. Everybody. As many as they can find. And that means you, even as an intern, if you are going into an internship or a field practicum, whatever your university calls them, you can be held accountable for activities and things that occur during the course of that time. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong to be sued. It just sometimes happens because usually people are upset about something when they file a lawsuit. They don't agree with something that happened. They try to look for somebody to blame, and you could be in that chain of events. So it's really important that you protect yourself. And the way you do that is with professional liability insurance. And then I thought it would be important for Lonnie to talk a little bit about what underwriting means and why that matters.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great point. And I did actually accidentally spy in the chat where somebody had a question about, so the purpose of professional liability insurance is to cover your lawyer's fees primarily. Yes, that is the primary use of professional liability insurance. But it also has some more benefits too. Like if you're worried about something happening, but you don't need an attorney yet, we actually have an individual risk management hotline that is only available to policyholders that can help you unpack troubling situations as well. But back to the question as far as what underwriting does. So underwriting, my job is to make sure that every policyholder has an opportunity to apply for our policy and keep their policy going, as long as they are in the profession. And sometimes I have to make troubling decisions as far as if you apply for a policy and perhaps had something in your experience that maybe it was a licensing board complaint or whatever, it doesn't mean that you're going to be turned away in any shape or form. We just want the ability to know about it, unpack it, find out what happened. And then most of the time, the circumstances will typically qualify with our underwriting guidelines, but we need that opportunity and that disclosure when you're applying for the policy. We ask a few questions. But I also make sure that our policy contract, especially in terms of new issues that come up. So nationwide, social workers in probably more than 20 states have actions in their state legislature that may have allowed them to serve a certain way in the past, but now maybe that regulation is changing the framework of which, based on the way that they would advise others. And so it's my job to make sure that I'm well acquainted with what those laws say and to make sure that our contract will still do exactly what we promised to the best of our ability.
Dwayne, do we have any questions right now that might be important for us to consider?
I think you covered some of the legal pieces, and where I see a huge support of assurance services and liability is really just getting general questions answered, that when people are in this gray space, I'm at my organization, maybe I'm getting sued, but maybe there's like this threat or something that feels fishy. Who do I go to for a consultation, right? Your NASW chapter is always a good place to go for that. But I often will send folks, especially if they're clinically based questions, to assurance services to make sure that they get advice. And so one of the questions is specifically like, do you help people find lawyers? And I think that's a good question that sometimes you'll find in the field. So I'm wondering if you could maybe just tackle that one quickly.
So
Well, I think it's important. I want Dina, just a second. I want to make a distinction. When we talk about what the professional liability insurance covers and how we have that organized and whether or not there's a hotline, it relates specifically to the assurance services RRG insurance policy. There are numbers of other companies that carry professional liability insurance or sell in professional liability insurance policies for social workers. When we speak, we need to make that clarification because not every insurance company does it exactly the same, which is important for you to know when you go out shopping for a policy. You need to make sure to read that policy and understand what they will cover and what they exclude and what other benefits they might offer. So please understand, when we're talking about any of these things related specifically to an insurance policy, we're talking about the one that's sold through the Insurance Services Inc. group. So go ahead and talk about what you were going to, Dina.
okay, so and Betsy has a good point that we have experience with the NASW Risk Retention Group Assurance Services Policy. But as a general rule, whichever insurance policy you hold, no matter which carrier you hold, if you have a question, we always encourage you reach out to that insurance carrier to see what benefits they have. If you happen to be an assurance services insured and hold that NASW policy, you can put in a risk management hotline question and possibly be connected to me. And we talk through all of this stuff. I'm seeing some great questions on the chat room. And oh, Alan, I wish I could answer your question, but my answer for that is I don't know. He's asking, Lonnie, he's asking about Texas law. And I'll get to that in a second, Alan, I promise. Yes, your insurance company will assist you in finding an attorney. Speaking directly for the NASW ASI policy, there is an attorney panel that we have worked with for many years. These are very experienced attorneys. They work with licensing issues and professional liability questions all the time. We have vetted these attorneys very carefully. And so we know they do great work, and we have attorneys in every state. And they're all phenomenal attorneys. So we've got, I guess that kind of covers that. Betsy, did I miss something?
I don't think so.
Well, that's a good explanation of that. I do wonder too, there's another similar question that we get often. So Alex asked, my organization has malpractice insurance. If our company has insurance for its employees, should we also get one of our own? And I also just want to twist that to students. If my school provides the blanket coverage for me, do I need an insurance policy of my own? Because that definitely was never talked to me about when I was in my program. So I wonder if you could just talk about that for Chris briefly.
Yeah, and
That's
Lonnie,
important.
Betsy, please jump in and interrupt me if I miss something here. We are not in the business of selling insurance today. That is not our job. However, having said that, we would always encourage you to have your own policy. The policies generally for social workers are not that expensive. And if you are working for an agency or a hospital or a group practice or a school or something along those lines, and something happens, you never know when the time is going to come when perhaps you may be at cross purposes with the agency. Additionally, when we did a presentation at the national conference recently, and the person that Betsy was talking about earlier, the attorney who is also a social worker, said that he represented a social worker at a deposition. The social worker had coverage through the agency, but there were so many people involved. Again, that goes back to filing the suit against anybody that touched the patient or the file or whatever through the course of their care. There were probably 10 people who had been sued from this agency. And this particular insured felt a little bit lost in the rubble. And so reached out to NASW, RRG, and said, can I please have an attorney? I just want to make sure my voice is being heard. And so that person had the agency's attorney, but also their own attorney who could explain what was going on and make sure that that person's interests were taken care of. I think it's a good idea. Betsy?
Well, there's another aspect of this that's really important that you understand. You need to ask your university or your agency what the policy covers. You need to know that because remember, the agency has that policy to protect the agency. If they think that you did something out of your scope of practice, and we'll talk some more about scope of practice because that's critical when you get into trouble, quite frankly. But if you do something outside of that scope of practice, or that the agency does not see that you adhere to the policy, rules, regulations, guidelines that they have, they can say, we're not covering you for this. So if you don't have your own personal liability policy, you don't have anybody on your side, and you may end up having to pay a lot of legal bills. So that's an important aspect to think about. For students, for those of you who are students and you're getting ready to go into the field, we do have a policy for students. Not every insurance company does, and it's not very expensive, and it's well worth it. I want to share a story with you about somebody who had this very issue. There was somebody working for a foster care agency, and they had a family meeting that ran late, past the normal working hours. And the bride that was supposed to pick up the mother of the child, whom they were meeting about, didn't show up. So the social worker volunteered to drop the mother off on the way home. And what ensued was a traffic accident. I think Dina talked to this person, right?
Yeah, I think I did.
So tell them what happened after the traffic accident.
Well, after the traffic accident happened, and the mother was hurt, then came the claim against the social worker for the damages for the mother who was hurt. Came the medical bills for the emergency room visit and ambulance calls and subsequent medical care, the claim was made to that specific social worker because she was driving the car.
And the agency's policy would not cover her because it was after hours and she did not get her supervisor's permission to drop the woman off.
And
that's
driving the clients is generally not a covered activity. So yeah, Lonnie's shaking her head no. So you need to be very careful about what you do. Even things as simple as walk and talk therapy.
Mhm.
There are a lot of questions that need to be answered before you start that. I spoke to a social worker who wanted to do things beyond walk and talk, like go for hikes, go climbing rock walls, going kayaking. And I got very nervous at that. But we talked through what her wish was, and to figure out what kind of consent she needed to have. Be careful.
Can I add to the auto situation? Just wanted to let you know, one way to protect yourself, and you'll, this will leaps and bounds solve the problem. If you know that there is the potential that you might have to drive somebody somewhere, just ask your agency, do you have coverage for that? Because there's actually an endorsement they can add to their general liability policy called a non-owned auto endorsement. And I know this is just going to hurt your brain because it's an insurance term, but it's literally the point of my suggestion is just ask the question, am I permitted to drive this person because you have to advocate and be supportive, and you're willing to do that. So you want to make sure that the agency, if you work for an agency, has that kind of coverage. If you don't, or let's say you have a private practice that changes things, then you start having to ask those kind of questions to your own auto insurance carrier. But you always want to, in the course of your work, you always want to make sure that you're asking those questions, because 9 times out of 10, unfortunately, in that case, it didn't exist, but 9 times out of 10, their coverage does exist, but you have to ask to make sure.
And I appreciate that distinction, Lonnie, because social work practice is changing constantly too. So even how insurance operates, and I learned this as I started at NASW, you've got social workers coming in doing new sorts of practice, or maybe things that have been around for a while but are getting a little bit more solidified. And so one example that I think about is like animal assisted social work, and like the complex range that encompasses in and of itself. Like if you use a horse in your practice versus a dog, there's like a different liability structure based off of that. One of my former coworkers, uses dogs in her practice, and like one of her dogs bit her in the middle of a session and like had to go to the emergency room in the middle of a session with the client, and the client had to drive her to the session. Like this complex web of like, you don't ever expect to like have something like that happen, but like weird things happen in our space, right? And that's where, what I've appreciated about working with you all in the past is that you actually like work with social workers. And so like, that we're kind of weird people, and that we're like in all of these strange spaces doing everything for like trying different modalities all the time. And now that we're into like this, moving more and more into cyber spaces and virtual spaces, I know that that's a whole different realm that we probably could go down a rabbit hole on. But I think a lot of the folks who are on this call too, as students in social work programs, you're going to be like helping invent some new areas of practice as you go into the field too. So there may not be existing coverage for certain things that may exist 10 years from now. And that's where we also are just going to need kind of your voice and your support as we develop those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Well, and just to talk about just telehealth, Dwayne, you touched on that. 2 years ago, other than in the state of Alaska, where everything is rural, so they had to do telehealth because they had to do telehealth to reach some of the more remote places. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, we didn't know about telehealth and social work because that just wasn't done. And then all of a sudden the COVID monster comes to town and refuses to leave. And now not only do you have clients that need your services and you need to be able to get to them, but you also have a bigger demand for your services, because now you've got people who are trapped in their homes with their families, and it's getting a little tense, and perhaps they need to talk to somebody, or there's somebody who's just panicking about the sheer volume of the COVID pandemic and what does it mean to me, and I'm afraid to go outside and breathe, and all of these things. So the demands on your time are even more. So you were dropped into, and maybe not necessarily you, but social workers were dropped into the realm of, today you're doing telehealth. You weren't yesterday, but today you are. Figure it out, go.
And they did.
And they did. And we have learned so much about telehealth. And we can certainly talk about the things that you need to know for telehealth as you get started. And this is probably just as good a pick off place as any, Betsy. What do you think?
Well, yeah, but I think before we do that, I think it's important we talk about scope of practice.
Sure.
Because I'm seeing lots of questions about new things that people are starting to do and challenges with new laws that states are practicing. So I think it's important, for the purpose of understanding what you're covered for with a liability insurance policy, it really relates to your scope of practice as it's defined by your employer. So your employer, or wherever you do your field practicum, they have a set of things that the agency does and they expect you to do. As long as you're acting within that realm, you're covered for events that occur or things that might happen. If you go outside of that and you do something that's outside your scope of practice, your professional liability insurance policy won't cover you. Lonnie, did I get that right? Is there something you want to add to that?
I would say, so I use the term allegations, professional allegations from your circle of work. So if you're a macro social worker, it's your macro social work. And if you, I think I saw another question where somebody works for an advocacy nonprofit. And so it's their work within, their advocacy nonprofit. The area where you're talking about, so keep in mind, if you're working within that circle, there are going to be times where maybe you're not aware of a regulation that you may have stepped over. And we're definitely not going to withdraw coverage because of that, because that's sort of an accident with that circle of professional work. But at the same time, the purpose of these type of, conversations is to position folks to be able to ask the right questions and avoid those situations, but sometimes they're unavoidable. And I'm going to give you an example. Every state regulation in all 50 states pretty much say that you cannot, and I'm just going to use this example, lend money to a client. Okay, like you can't have a written up loan or something. Now it's a boundary issue. So, but we've had that happen before, and we've defended folks for doing that. So when you're talking about coverage or not coverage, it really needs to be foundationally associated with your work with that circle I was talking about, your professional circle. One thing that typically falls outside of that is, let's say you got in trouble because you forgot to renew your license for over a year, but none of your clients complained about it. Well, your circle didn't complain about it. You're in trouble with licensing. That's sort of kind of a maintenance or an expectation. So typically those type of things wouldn't be covered. That's a good example of a regulation that we would, provide support on. But especially, and I'm just going to unpack this in terms of some of the recent state legislative efforts in the LGBT community, abortion, and there's some even other pieces. As you're navigating through that, and I saw a question pop up, you're navigating understanding that there is a law in place, and you really need to unpack how to, in the best possible risk management framework, how to walk forward, providing the services, but also limiting your exposure to a lawsuit. Keep in mind when you're working with your clients and that framework is there, and I use the term clients, but we have different social workers that do different things. So it's that circle that you're typically working in. We're there to support you, but keep in mind, when you pass over a regulation and say it doesn't, that even though it may be something that is challenging, it is still a regulation. So we will, in many terms, as long as it qualifies, we will go ahead and provide a defense, but some regulations are harder to overcome, is what I'm saying. And that even falls into the new efforts where, you're challenged because you need to provide the appropriate supports, but now the regulatory framework is starting to change. So I would recommend anytime you're walking in that neighborhood is to make sure that you're working with, if you're not an insured of NASW risk retention group, that you're working with your insurance carrier to unpack risk management strategies and walking forward there. With NASW risk retention group, through Dina's team, they actually have risk management experts that can individually unpack what you're doing, the regulatory framework, and give you the type of advice that says, these are the things that you should work to avoid, and these are the type of documentation efforts I recommend. And they will give you a framework suited to your individual pathway. So I'm sorry to make that long, but I think that's, in the new current environment, there's over 20 states pursuing differing regulations. So it's very important to know what to do at the time when you have those challenges in your work with your circle.
Yeah, and
The other, just to tag in behind Lonnie real quick, the other thing that we suggest to all of you as you get into that, and Texas always comes to mind first because they have been at the forefront of state regulation, and that state law was reversed and then appealed, and it's been challenged, and it's in flux. You know that. All of the Texas people on here know what a slippery slope and a very thin line this is to walk. We suggest very strongly that you stay in touch with the NASW Texas chapter. I have spoken to them last week, a couple of times last week, to say, hey, what are you guys seeing on this? They are trying to wrap their arms around what we're dealing with here as well. Between the state law, Senate Bill 8 for all of you Texas people, in connection with the reversal of the Roe versus Wade decision, and then how new state laws are coming in behind that, and bills are being proposed to the state legislature. All of these different things are going on. The NASW Texas chapter is doing their best to wrap their arms around this. You can reach out to your state licensing board, see what they have learned about this. If you have a good friend who's an attorney, I tell social workers this all the time, invite them over for pizza and beer on Friday night and talk to them. Tell me about this. What do you think? What can I say? How far can I press this before I'm going to get stuck, before I'm going to get hung? Stay in touch with your colleagues. Ask the questions before you give the advice to your clients. You need to know where you're standing before you start moving forward. Otherwise, you might walk off a cliff and never know it.
I think it's important for people to understand that in general, if you're actively breaking a law or an established regulation,
Yeah,
most insurance companies will not cover that.
it's actually, it's very hard to defend. I mean, take, for example, we can throw, many different defenders at it, but at the end of the day, if it's proven, it's not incorrect, it's very hard to have without outcomes.
It's very difficult. So I can't express how sad I feel that we're having to have discussions about practices that we would engage in as social workers because they are affirming and because it has to do with care for people, while we have to consider how much trouble is everybody going to get in if you engage in that. And I don't think any of us have real good questions about that. I've seen several issues like that, and it's awful. And obviously we're going to have to pull out our advocacy skills and start trying to change some of these things. But right now, this is in the environment in which we live, and we're going to have to work together to figure out how to move forward.
Yeah, and I can just talk briefly from the NASW side. I mean, the advocacy piece is really important, and that's not the purpose of today's call, but it also is the purpose of every call we're on in social work, is that whole advocacy wing. I did drop a couple of links into the chat. NASW just put out an action alert on the Women's Health Protection Act. So if you haven't already signed on to that or asked your legislatures to do that, please do so, as well as I linked the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, Voting as Social Work. If you're not registered, if you need to change your voter registration, please share that. I know many of the NASW chapters are doing voter mobilization, but a lot of this does depend on who's in office in our states. And it is such a complex web across the country. We've got states who've got really social work supportive policies, and we've got some states who are doing some really terrible things. And how do we balance practicing ethically where it may be illegal to do so? And I think we're seeing those questions come more to the forefront, especially over this last year with the right to choose, as well as gender affirming care, bans on trans athletes, all this sort of stuff. And please connect with your local NASW chapter to see what work, if any, is being done locally to do that. I will say one of the things internally to every state is you have a board of social work or some equivalent of that. Who serves on that is also really important to these conversations about what might happen to you if you get a complaint filed against you. If you've got folks who are on one side of a position versus the other on there, those are usually appointed boards. And I know in Michigan, our NASW chapter works to get social workers appointed to our board of social work as much as possible. But that's a really good space to make sure you know who's on your board of social work, that you're attending those meetings if you can. They're all, I believe, publicly open to attend, and that you bring these issues to those folks, because ultimately those are going to be the social workers, a small subset even of your boards, who take disciplinary action if there are ethics complaints filed against somebody. And so beyond your liability in your field, like that's like the practice implication. And so they may say, nope, you're practicing according to your code of ethics, even though it may be illegal or gray area in our state policy right now. We're not going to actually perpetuate or give any sanctions to people who are breaking that particular piece. And then that also trickles usually up to your governor or your attorney general, who is appointing people into those positions. So it's one of those social work systems issues that we all have to know about a little bit more as well.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Betsy, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this issue, while yes, it's important to you guys, for those of you who are students or just getting out, just getting ready to take your test, I wanted to give an example of, to kind of bring it back home a little closer, a situation that I had, I believe it was 3 weeks ago, with a social work student who was out in his field placement. And he was out working, getting some clinical hours, and he'd been assigned by the university to work at this particular practice. And when he got to the particular practice, the guy who was going to supervise him said, yeah, I don't want you to work at this practice. I want you to work over here at this other nonprofit place. And so the student was told, you can work here and you can bill insurance companies here. And so the student did it, not knowing that he shouldn't do it. So this kind of comes back to, these are the things that can happen to you as a student. This comes back to ask questions.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Am I supposed to be doing this? Is this under my, is this covered by my field placement activities? Does my university provided insurance cover this? In this particular case, his university insurance said, no, we don't cover that. But because he had an NASW assured services policy, he's got coverage for it.
Well, one example of that that's also in the chat from Elena, her experience was, I was riding in my agency's car as an intern and the employee crashed. My school and the agency refused to cover me in the accident, even though I was the passenger and it was required of me to ride with that staff member. Had they had their own insurance coverage, would it have been an issue? From that limit, I mean, you don't know all the details, but like, if somebody had a separate individual policy outside of their school.
I don't know that the professional liability policy would have covered. It's worth submitting it to them for a coverage review. I would also submit it to your personal auto insurance. You may have coverage through that. It's worth asking the question. I tell social workers this all the time, and I tell them the worst thing that somebody can tell you is no, there's no coverage. But they might tell you, yes, there is. Ask the question.
Yeah, and the other question I always suggest students ask is, especially if you are planning to do intern time in the off semester, so even if it's in breaks like spring break, winter break, over the summer, does your school's liability policy cover those off chances? Because sometimes they don't. And if that's the case, you definitely want to have your own policy in that situation.
And actually, even though you're maybe still a student, and you're outside of field placement, you would just contact us and we can upgrade you to an individual policy. It's not much more. It's like dollars to donuts. It's like $12 to $20 more for that transition.
Going back, I've been trying to catch chat questions and I've noticed a couple. Somebody asked about the difference between general liability, personal liability, and then now we have cyber liability. So I think it's probably important for us to describe those differences. Which one of you would like to start?
Yeah, I can do that. And I'll try and take my insurance hat off. Okay, so professional liability, just like I've been talking about, is your work related to your circle of professional work. You're doing it. You could be held responsible for that. Separately, general liability is in the course of my efforts, when my client's coming to my appointment or maybe leaving from my appointment, could I be held responsible for injuries in their back and forth kind of thing? If you're not meeting with clients in person, or if your agency has that type of coverage already, your likelihood of using it is very low. So I recommend, just sort of kind of considering maybe not having it in those circumstances. But the one thing is that I mentioned, if you're not meeting with clients in person, but if you're on the web using telehealth resources, I do suggest a cyber liability policy. And that cyber liability policy is associated with, now keep in mind, we're using Zoom right now. Neither Dwayne, myself, or Dina, or Betsy own Zoom. So if a breach happened and we were in the course of working with somebody, Zoom's responsible for it. And a cyber policy covers your interests when you're using applications that are not within your care, custody, and control, but you have to use them. So of course you do your homework and make sure that your resources comply with HIPAA. But at the same time, there's good examples, and we all know enough that even the best platforms that we're using, and that could even be a note documentation platform that you're using, they're all run by other companies. So if they fail you, that's where our cyber liability insurance policy kicks in and provides you support in navigating that effort. Also, if one of those issues in that category cause a situation on your computer, and now you have possibly some type of bad virus on it, there's even a component of that cyber coverage that you were using for work that you could take to like the Geek Squad at your local information technology resource center, where they can do an assessment of that laptop if a breach occurred, that you had reported to us. So it's part of that resource that if you feel as though your computer has been violated, that you can have a security expert review it and take an analysis of it.
You want to add anything, Dina?
Yeah, I am the sharer of all things horror stories, because that's what I do. I've always got good examples, and Lonnie was talking about the cyber coverage and getting your computer hacked and all that kind of thing. I've got a better example that is a real life example from within the last month and a half. We had a social worker who called in because her cell phone had been hacked, and it got hacked by one of the employees at the store where she bought the phone and where she was getting her cell phone service through. And she didn't realize that she had been hacked until some of her clients said, hey, I've got some weird charges on my credit card, and you're the only one who's charged my card recently. So she's taking payments like with that Square or something like that through her phone. And this guy at the local cell phone store is tapping into her system, into her phone, getting these credit card numbers and making charges with them. She got hacked. But because she had that third party, that extra cyber liability policy, she was covered for what it would take to get the phone looked at, to notify the clients, this is what has happened, this is what I've done, do all the letters required. If she needed to report it to HHS, because that's who keeps track of HIPAA, that was taken care of that way. So you never know what's going to get hacked or where it's going to come from.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So those basically are the three we offer: professional liability that covers your activities during as you're working on your job and the scope of practice with your job; general liability that covers if you're in private practice and you own an office somewhere. It covers if people fall down your steps and that kind of stuff, just like your general liability in your house. And cyber liability that works to cover the new technology issues that we have. I think that one of the things that I've learned, having been on the board, that I like to share with people is that social workers are not unfamiliar with regulation. We live with all kinds of regulations, and you all know that. I can tell you that the insurance industry is probably more regulated than we are, which was a surprise to me. But because of the way in which it is regulated, that's why we have these different lanes of insurance. It's the easiest way for us to describe it. We can't put the cyber policy and include it in a professional liability policy. We can bundle them, but they have to be separate policies. So that's just kind of a little bit of info about how the insurance world works. That was a surprise to me. I didn't have any idea about that when we started doing that. Another interesting question I saw was someone asking about if they're supervisors and about supervisory coverage. And I think, again, the answer to that is that your job responsibility includes supervision. So yes, you would be covered for things that happen in the course of supervision. And for supervisors, vicarious liability is a big part of that, where if the people they're supervising go off and do something stupid, they also can be held in account for that. So yes, it would cover that. And I will tell you that I also want to make you all aware that we have a number of recorded sessions where we talk specifically about supervisors and risk management strategies for them. We don't have time to cover all the risk management issues in this conversation because we're really talking about insurance policies. But there are things you can do to protect yourself and make it easier for yourself in the event that something goes awry. And one of the most important parts of that is documenting your activities with your supervisees. Anything anybody wants to add to that?
Yeah, the one thing that has come up with different supervisory issues, again, on the hotline, is that sometimes the supervisor is not necessarily aware if their state has specific requirements for them to be a supervisor. There are some states that you have to apply to the licensing board to be a supervisor, and you have to be approved. And then once you are approved, there's certain documentation that you need to keep. You need to meet with them for so many hours a week. Things have to be signed off on, and you need to have things done absolutely right. Or when that poor little supervisee who has just spent 2 years getting all of their clinical hours goes to turn that stuff in, half the hours are disqualified because they weren't done the way the board wanted them. So now that poor little supervisee has to go back and work another year getting clinical hours because it wasn't done correctly. So what I would say to the person who asked that supervisor question, make sure if your state board has rules around your supervisory activities, follow them faithfully and check in from time to time. Have the rules changed? Are there new rules? Have you gotten rid of some of the old ones? Just to make sure that you are following what you should be doing to keep both you and the supervisee out of trouble.
And if you're supervising in an agency, you just need to keep records. That's an important thing to do. I also noticed some people are asking, well, what about this kind of practice? Mediation was one of them. What about this kind? Again, if you are in whatever your job is, if your job is a mediator, then if you're practicing within that scope of practice, your professional liability insurance policy will be there for you. Right?
If there's any doubt, call the insurance company, whether it's Assurance Services or whatever insurance policy you hold, call them and ask the specific question. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of mediations. Does my policy cover mediations? Does it cover mediation activities?
And that's a good example of how every social worker's practice is going to be a little bit different. And there's going to be those situations like, I don't know if I'm covered or if I should be covered, or as I'm adding this extra thing onto my practice, right? There's a lot of folks who are now doing like yoga or like mindfulness-based things. Like, how is that incorporated into your clients? Or that example you gave earlier about, let's go outside in nature. We're going to go do, more environment-based therapy, right? Mm-hmm. Or as new modalities pop up, how that may impact your liability risks. And I think the supervision question is something that we get regularly, especially from the student side too. We had a situation in Michigan a couple of years ago where a supervisor gave a supervisee incorrect information during during their time together. And it led to, ultimately there was a kid that lost their life because of some incorrect practice guidance that was given by a supervisor. And so both the student and the supervisor went to trial, right? They had to go to court, and that was a situation that you hope that your supervisors or mentors are giving you correct information, but sometimes as a student, like, you don't know what you don't know.
No.
And you trust these professionals and your school, especially if they're assigning you somewhere, to put you in some space. And, sometimes they don't know either. And if you get in one of these situations where you do find yourself in a lawsuit, which is very rare, right? Like, students are not going to be in lawsuits that often, but like Dina says, there's these horror stories that we hear of. Luckily for the student, they didn't get charged with it at the end of the day, but it really was kind of an eye-opening example of how that supervisor-supervisee relationship is so critical, and we just need to be very mindful of that, even post-graduation. When you're in the field and getting your licensure hours, you want that supervisor, and you need that supervisor to be competent, to be ethically practicing, to be connected, right? Because they really are your mentor for those first couple of years while you're in the field.
One other thing, just real quick, Betsy, before we move off the mediation thing, one of the other questions that we get a lot is there are social workers who want to start a coaching practice. And how is that tied in? Those two are separate because you don't have a license to be a coach. I don't know that there are, not like you have for a social worker. You go to school for social work, you get clinical hours, you sit for the exam, you get your license. Coaching, I don't believe that's the case. Maybe you get certified. Those two are going to be two separate things. So that's all about staying in your lane, knowing what the scope of your license is, staying in your circle, all of those things. That all ties together like that.
One of the things I wanted to share with you all is, because we're talking about all these awful things that could potentially happen, I want you to know, in the realm of insurance groups that cover different sorts of professional practices, we have, as social workers, one of the best, I'm trying not to use social work terms, but fewer social workers get in trouble than other professionals on an ongoing basis. And I firmly believe that has to do with our very robust code of ethics. We think about ethical practice as part of our everyday routine, and we want to practice ethically. It's really critical. And because of that, we've been able to keep the cost of insurance pretty low for social workers through our policies. So that's a really positive thing about being in social work practice. So kudos to you all, and remember that code of ethics. It makes a big difference. I noticed that there have been several questions about private practice, and people asking about that. It's really critical, if you're in private practice, that you have a PLI policy, and probably you could need the other two. You probably need cyber, and if you're doing telehealth, cyber is pretty critical to your practice. You may need general liability if you're running that practice in your house, or if you have an office where you run that you're responsible for what happens in that office. So I don't know if that answers the question. If I didn't answer the question for people from private practice, please submit it again, and we'll try again. Telehealth, there's a number of questions about that. Who would like to dive into telehealth? Dina's laughing, I bet.
I'll start, because I answered a telehealth question just this morning. And it's a rare day that I don't, quite honestly. We have, Lonnie and I had a chat a little earlier, and there are 3 things that you need to keep in mind when you're doing telehealth. First question that you always ask: where is the client located? You need to know that. And when you do a telehealth session, that should be the first question out of your mouth. Where are you? Where are you located? It's not just for the medical issues, in case the client has a meltdown and you need to get them emergency help. It is also to protect you and your license. Because if that client is sitting in a place where you are not licensed, you can get into trouble very quickly. You will be practicing without a license. Now, I do acknowledge that COVID opened the gates about practicing across state lines, but as COVID is getting more under control, the states are closing those doors. And each state has regulations about, yes, you can get a temporary license here. No, you can't have one over there. Don't you even think about talking to people in our state because you have to be licensed here, and that's California. Know where your client is standing. It's important for their safety, but it's important for your license safety as well. Number 2, where are you located? This was a question I talked to somebody about this morning. The social worker asked, I'm going to go on vacation. And so I'm not moving, but I'm going to be in another state for a couple of weeks. Can I talk to my clients? I said, no, please go on vacation. Please go on vacation. You deserve a vacation just like everybody else does. You don't want to practice. You don't want to be standing in a state where you're not licensed, even though you're calling your home state where you are licensed, and that's where the client's standing. I have on my desk right now a licensing board complaint filed by one state against a social worker licensed in another state. And I want to say that the board that filed the complaint is in Ohio, but don't quote me on that. Ohio filed a board complaint against the social worker's license in New Jersey because that social worker was standing in Ohio when they practiced. Ohio filed the board complaint in New Jersey alleging failure or practicing without a license, and they had that social worker dead to rights. You can't argue that. Where are you standing? You better be licensed there. If you're not licensed there, please go on vacation, please. Snowbirding is a different situation. If you're going to go somewhere for 3 or 4 months out of the year, do your homework, investigate the laws in Florida or Arizona or wherever you're going to snowbird, and find out what it takes to have a temporary license there. Cover yourself. Do your homework ahead of time. This is not the time to get forgiveness. This is time to get approval instead of forgiveness. You always want to know, where are you licensed and are those licenses active? I have talked to so many social workers recently who, because of the pandemic and rules were being loosened up a little bit, they forgot to renew their license. And the board had said they were giving them a little bit of slack, but then the slack went away and the social worker didn't pick up on it. Now they're practicing without a license. Now they got to go through the whole process again. It's painful. Please, if you value the few dark hairs still left on my head, don't practice across state lines. Please.
Thanks for that, Dina. And I did drop into the chat too. There's been some information released. I was on the 8th around the Social Work Licensing Compact, which somewhat hopes to address some of this in states that will pass a compact. It's going to be a multi-year effort. So definitely everyone who's on this, if you are supportive of trying to make reciprocity easier, that process is going to really get underway next year once the draft language gets announced. But every state has to get it passed individually. So it's going to take a lot of collective efforts in each one of our states to get that through. And there are going to be states where it's not going to happen, and just realistically because of the politics in some of the states. But we want to try to get as many states as possible to make that a reality, so it is easier for folks to be able to be dual licensed or multi-licensed.
Well, I also want to say to people, we understand that you want to support your clients. And it's very frustrating to hear this from us over and over again. And I noticed a couple of of examples. Well, what if this is happening, or what if this is happening? The bottom line is you have to be licensed where you're standing and where that client's standing. Even if you worked with them for 15 years and they decided to go off and they want to keep working with you and they go to another state, if you're not licensed in that state, or that state does not allow some kind of temporary licensure or visitation licensure or some of that stuff, it is not in your best interest to continue to see them, because they can file that you're practicing in that state without a license, because you don't have a license in the state that your client went to. And I know part of the pain, I've talked to lots of social workers that struggle, particularly if they work in universities and colleges, and they'll be working with a student for a whole period of time, and then they go off home for some, home period of time, and they still want to see their social worker. Well, I'm sorry, you can't. And you know what? If you lose your license, you're not going to be able to help any clients. So you have to think about it that way. It is just the most frustrating thing, and we're thrilled about the Interstate Compact development, and that they're really working hard. NASW is working with this. The AASWB, if you don't know what that is, that's the organization that writes the tests that you take for licensure. By the way, that particular website has information on every state. So you can go there and you can look up what's going on. That doesn't mean that you may not need to contact the state board, but it at least gives you a place to start.
It'll give you the links.
Yes.
Just click, do a search, and it's actually a very user-friendly site.
It really is. ASWB.org. It's a wonderful resource. It has the regulations by state for practicing across lines, and is there an option for temporary license, all that stuff that's available right now. And they're being very good about staying on top of that. So until we get that 5-year interstate reciprocity thing going, that's a great resource for you to have.
Yeah, and I see a question from Gina, just clarifying. So you need to be licensed in the state that your client is located in. You don't necessarily have to be licensed in the state you're currently living in. We know people move around, but you have to be licensed in the state that your client is located in.
And where you are.
And where you are
physically, yes. And where they are physically.
You may want to check, because there's some states who have that as a requirement, and some states don't.
Well, that's why you need to go look.
Yeah, you need to look for both. Yeah.
Assume the most rigid rule and then go look, so that you don't get in trouble. Yeah, that's the most important thing.
So one question that came through early on from someone was, I'm not working in the field just yet, but where could somebody go if they wanted more information on liability insurance? And if you're a military family and plan on beginning your career, but may move around a lot, what's the best option for you in that setting?
Betsy, do you want that, or you want me to jump on?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. So if you're a military and you're going to move around a great deal, as long as you're operating appropriately in each state, which we just covered, what you're going to do is have the ability to have coverage in each of the states, because the foundational requirement on the policy is that the lawsuit is placed in the 50 states. And also, I think if you're in Puerto Rico, but that's a long story. But anywho, basically US states, as long as it's filed in those states, the coverage does follow you. So you would just buy one policy. You don't have to change it. But of course, you want to change the address and let us know so we can send you things if we need to. Then
Excuse me, Lonnie, could I add one thing to that? Military bases are often considered US soil. So if even if you're in Germany and you're operating in your practice is at that military base, you just need one policy.
Right. The only thing is you can't serve citizens of Germany. You just have to be
Right.
serving US citizens because their grievance process is in the US.
Mhm.
It's a complicated web, this social work world we're in.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
So as far as a place for resources, I think earlier in the presentation, you shared the NASW Assurance Services link related to liability, and it goes through all of our liability products. The nice thing is it's also a repository for all of our telehealth risk management checklists. It's also a repository for all of our cutting edge regulatory information and you know, everything that we've ever covered. We even have like we have a person in our office that puts together a malpractice tip of the month. And I have to tell you, maybe I'm just a little partial, but I think that they're actually very interesting. So there's a lot of resources there, but it's a very user-friendly site.
I also want to add, somebody asked if we have a list of recommended insurances that they could investigate. And I have to be honest and say, no, we do not have a list of other insurance companies because obviously we think our insurance is the best and we'd like you to really look at that. But I really don't, you're going to have to do that work on your own if you want to go to a different insurance company.
My suggestion would be go to a Google page and type in professional liability insurance for social workers.
Yeah.
I think that's where you're going to get a list. As Betsy said, yeah, we think ours is the best, so that's going to be what we're going to recommend. But in all fairness, truthfully, if I had to do that, that's what I do. I'd go, God bless Google. I don't know how I'd get through the day without it. But go to Google and just type in professional liability insurance for social workers.
And what I would recommend for folks, you know, if you're shopping around, there's a couple of things, you know, we're an ethics-based field, so that also translates into hopefully your liability or your other things that you're doing with social work. Learn about not just necessarily who may be the cheapest, but look at who's on their board, look at if they're providing services back into the field, look at what resources are available on in terms of practice or educational resources on their website, because that does make a difference too. Not all liability insurances have social workers on their boards. And I think that that's an important thing. I don't work for assurance services, so I can say that. But that for me has been a big difference in terms of how I have interacted personally with various insurances and how they understand what social work practice is at the end of the day as well.
And actually, to that point, if we make an adverse underwriting decision, I hand it over to a committee of social workers to review it. And a lot of times there are results where there is, because of the professional competency and reviewing the circumstance, they're able to overturn it and point out the reasons why. So we have a very, very robust advocacy process in that regard. And just so you know, the other carriers in the field, once they make a decision, the decision is the decision. There's not an appeals process. And I do know that for a fact because I'm not to date myself, but I've worked for a number of different carriers.
Thank you for that. Now, I know we're getting towards the end of our time. You all have had some great questions today. I really have appreciated this discussion. So I wanted to give our panelists one kind of opportunity to give us one last tip or thing that folks should be thinking about as you move past our conversation today. And Dina, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay. I'm going to hog the best one for me because that's how I roll. If you have an issue, if you get a letter from an attorney, if you get a legal document, if you get a subpoena, if you get a licensing board complaint or a letter from the licensing board or a phone call from the licensing board, because not all licensing boards send out letters. You may get a phone call from an investigator saying, "Hi, I'm an investigator for state licensing board. I want to talk to you because there's a complaint filed against you." If you get that phone call, say, "I need to consult with my personal attorney. I'll call you back," and hang up. Quite honestly, the first thing you should do as soon as you get that document, that phone call, that email, whatever, call your liability carrier. Do it right away. This is not one of those things that gets better the longer it sits on your desk. In fact, by waiting, you can make it more difficult to help defend you, because these responses have a time deadline. And if you wait until it's too late, we can't get an attorney in there to help you if you need it. Whatever liability carrier you have, whether it's Assurance Services or whoever, please call them first. This is not the time to go to your Facebook chat people or whatever social media chat you have. This is not the time to go to all your social work buddies and say, hey, this is what I got. What do you think I should do? Please call your insurance carrier first. They're your first line of defense. They can get you the best help that there is. That's my suggestion.
All right.
And
Lonnie.
this is back to the car situation. So just like your practice, you would never ever drive a car without insurance, just because I know I'd be out of a lot of money, especially with the cost of used cars today. Second, when you're driving that car and you know you paid up your insurance, don't you call your insurance agent to say, hey, I sold that car. I'm not using that car anymore. You need to call us if you decide to stop a professional liability insurance policy. There may be a lot of reasons why we may be able to make an accommodation, like if you're out for maternity leave and we can give you a break during that time frame. We have all sorts of solutions, but the most important reason behind that is because if you let it run out and you don't tell us that you plan to stop, there's only a certain amount of time to be able to get what we call a tail in the industry. It's a special endorsement associated with a low-cost policy. So if call your insurance carrier, if you're midterm, we'll send you a refund for the unused premium, but we need to give you that offer of coverage. So it's really, really important.
And Betsy, take us out.
Okay, what I want to say to you is that you are not in this alone. And there are people who you can talk to who will help you think through some of the most difficult situations you have. You have resources. If you have our policy, you can call the helpline, the hotline that we have. Or if you're an NASW member, you can call their ethics group and they'll work through things with you. The most important thing is that risk management is good practice for you and for your clients. And the more you think about it and you learn about it, the better your practice will be and the safer you'll be while doing it. And thank you. It's been fun to be with you today.
Well, and I want to just thank everybody for joining us today. This was probably the one session of all the ones we've had this year that I did not know how people would react to and what sort of questions people would have, and you all have been fabulous. I have dropped a couple of links into the chat, including the registration for our next webinar, which will be August 18th on student loan debt. Who knows, things could be really different in student loan debt later this year. So we're going to keep our fingers crossed and our advocacy working around that debt, but we want to make sure you all have as many resources as you can around that. I also want to encourage folks, if you're not already active on the My NASW student community, every student NASW member is automatically a part of that community. So you're welcome to go and network, to share resources, to ask questions, and your colleagues from all across the country can connect with you there. It's a really great resource there. We're all learning in all of these webinars. So I just want to say someone really nicely called me out in the chat. I used the word stupid at some point. So thank you. I think I appreciate that about social work, where we're always learning and growing from each other. So thank you for that. We're always changing our dictionary and our internal lexicon. So I want to thank you, Lonnie, Dina, and Betsy, for your time today. We will have the recording available. It'll probably be up sometime next week. So if you want to watch any part of it again, and then if you go to that link into the chat box around all of the NASW student series, if you missed any of our other conversations, including the ones around licensing, you can find all the recordings for that there. So thank you all. I hope you have a great rest of your summer, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.